Hello everyone, welcome back, and in this video we are going to learn auditory pathway, and this auditory pathway is a small section of auditory sensation what we were dealing with. So when we study about auditory pathway, this is the pathway in which the sensation which has been transduced from the sound energy to the electrical energy with the help of the receptor organ, that is the organ of Corti. So once the sound energy has been transduced from the sound energy as such to the electrical energy with the help of the receptor organ of Corti, that has to be taken to the brain where it has to be analyzed and it has to be interpreted in association with various other sensations also. So the function of carrying those signal is done by the pathway which is called as auditory pathway. Now as you can see here in this diagram, this is the inner ear, the transverse section or the cross section of the inner ear, and you can see the organ of Corti which is present here, and there are hair cells which are present, the inner hair cells and the outer hair cells. Mostly the nerves which are coming out and going in the auditory pathway is coming from the inner hair cells. 95% of the nerves are coming from inner hair cells, 5% of the nerves are coming from the outer hair cells. So as you can see, these hair cells then gives off the nerve, and these nerves goes and form the spiral ganglion which is present at the modulus of the cochlea itself. Okay, so in a much detail about that nerves, you can see here that the hair cell give rise to the neuron, and those neurons, or in other terms you can understand the hair cell as an extension of one of the end of the neurons, as receptors are basically the modified nerve endings. So these hair cells which are present here are the modified nerve endings which are converting the sound energy into the electrical energy, and then that electrical energy is being passed on to the further neurons. So this hair cell giving off this neuron and coming here and forming the spiral ganglion, and the neurons which are coming out of the spiral ganglion are connecting together, as you can see, from all the parts of the cochlea. These are the different parts of cochlea, and those neurons are collecting together, joining together and forming the cochlear nerve. Okay, so let us have the look at the auditory pathway itself, and this is the diagram depicting the auditory pathway. So we spoke about the spiral ganglion of Corti, that means the hair cells which are giving rise to the neurons, and then they are coming and forming the spiral ganglion of Corti which is present in the near the cochlea, that is the modulus of the cochlea, and from there they are forming the cochlear nerve. Okay, so this cochlear nerve or auditory nerve, also the cranial nerve number 8 is coming, and it is joining or it is synapsing at a place in the medulla, and that place in the medulla is present at the upper part of medulla, and that nuclei where the synapse is taking place is called as the cochlear nuclei. Okay, so particularly here are the list of various places where the important places in the auditory pathway where the synapse is taking place, or where they are ending for performing certain function. Okay, so these are the places which might act as relay center, or it might act as a lower level of interpretation center for the auditory signals. So once the signal which are coming from the hair cells are going to the spiral ganglion, from there they are forming the cochlear nerve or the auditory nerve, and from there they are synapsing in the cochlear nuclei which is present in the upper part of the medulla. From there the second order neuron arises, and the second order neuron goes to the second destination, what is called as superior olivary nucleus. Okay, so this is the second destination for our auditory pathway, that is the superior olivary nucleus. One thing you have to notice here is most of the neurons which are arising from the cochlear nuclei, they travel, they crosses to the opposite side and then supplies to the superior olivary nucleus. And the most important aspect of auditory pathway is the signals from the one side of the ear, one side of the inner ear or the cochlea, what you have to say, is going to majorly to the opposite side of the brain. Okay, so the left side of the cochlear signals are going predominantly to the right side of the brain, and the right side of the cochlear signals are going predominantly to the left side of the brain. However, the crossover occurs and there is supply from one ear to both the cortex, both side of the cortex. So that doesn't mean that it is only supplying to the one side of the cortex. The crossover occurs at three places. Okay, and I will mention those three places. And because of that crossover, what is happening is the signal from one ear is going to both the side of the cortex, both the cortex, and predominantly to one cortex, but still it is going to both of the cortex, both side of the cortex, this as well as this side of the cortex. So where are the three places where the crossing over is taking place? The first place you have seen here is at the level of the medulla at the trapezoid body. Okay, the second place where the crossing over of the signal is taking place is the commissural fibers joining these two nuclei, which we will deal with next. Okay, so there are commissural fibers which are joining these two parts, these two different sides, the right and the left part of the nucleus of lateral lemniscus, and there are commissural fibers which are joining the inferior colliculus also. Okay, so the two different parts of the inferior colliculus are joined together with the help of commissural fibers, and the two different sides of nucleus of lateral lemniscus are also joined together with the help of commissural fibers, and thus at these three places, the trapezoid body where the neurons are crossing over to the opposite side, and at this level the nucleus of lateral lemniscus where the commissural fibers are joining each other, and at the level of inferior colliculus where the commissural fibers are joining the both side of the inferior colliculus. There the mixing of the signal is taking place, so that the signal predominantly goes to one side of the brain, the contralateral side, whereas also goes to the ipsilateral side of the auditory cortex. So that is the feature of the signal going to both sides. So let us continue with the pathway now. Continuing the pathway, as we were seeing the cochlear nuclei, what is happening is the second order neuron is going to the superior olivary nucleus. Majorly, some are going to the contralateral side of the superior olivary nucleus, and few fibers are also supplying to the ipsilateral side of the superior olivary nucleus, and some fiber are bypassing the superior olivary nucleus, as you can see here. So one of the major function of the superior olivary nucleus is detection of the direction of the sound. So what superior olivary nucleus is involved in is it is majorly responsible for detection of the direction from where the sound is coming and its orientation in the 3D environment where the subject or where the individual is located. So that is the function of superior olivary nucleus. So as you can see from the spiral ganglion of Corti, it is forming the cochlear nerve and going to the cochlear nucleus, which is present in the medulla, as you can see here. The second destination is superior olivary nucleus. Majorly they synapse at the contralateral, few synapse at the ipsilateral, and few bypasses without synapsing at all. Now the third destination is nucleus of lateral lemniscus, and it is the synapse is similar to the superior olivary nucleus, that is few fibers synapse at the lateral lemniscus, whereas most of the fibers do not synapse at the lateral lemniscus, and then they go bypassing the lateral lemniscus, majority of the fibers goes to the inferior colliculus. Okay, so the next destination is inferior colliculus, which is present in the midbrain. So this inferior colliculus, almost all of the neurons are going to synapse here. So whatever neurons are coming from the cochlear nucleus, majority of them are bypassing these two nucleus and synapsing, almost all of them are synapsing at the inferior colliculus. Okay, so some of them are synapsing at superior olivary as well as at the lateral lemniscus, the nucleus of lateral lemniscus, but majority are coming directly from the cochlear nucleus to the inferior colliculus, and then almost all of them which are coming, they are synapsing here. Now from the inferior colliculus, the neurons, the next order neurons are arising and going to the medial geniculate nucleus. Medial geniculate nucleus in the midbrain, the thalamus area, and it is always asked in MCQs or in certain exams, entrance exams, that which part of the thalamus is involved in auditory sensation, in relaying the auditory sensation, and which part is involved in relaying the visual sensation. So if you remember, the visual sensation is relayed by the lateral geniculate body, lateral geniculate nucleus, whereas the auditory sensation here in this case is relayed by the medial geniculate nucleus. So the neurons which are arising from the inferior colliculus, all of them are synapsing again at the medial geniculate nucleus, and from the medial geniculate nucleus the next order neuron are arising and they are going and sending their signal to the auditory cortex. So this is the basic pathway. Again, if you have to see that they are arising from the hair cells, forming the nerve endings are the hair cells, and those nerves are forming spiral ganglion. From the spiral ganglion, the other ends are forming the cochlear nerve or the auditory nerve, the cranial nerve number 8, and they are synapsing at the cochlear nuclei which is present in the medulla. Majority of them will go to the opposite side and go straight away to the inferior colliculus. Some of them synapse in the superior olivary nucleus and lateral nucleus of lateral lemniscus and then go to the inferior colliculus. From here, all of them goes to the medial geniculate nucleus, and from the medial geniculate nucleus to the auditory cortex. So that is the pathway, and the crossover, as we have discussed, occurring at the level of trapezoid body in the medulla and the commissural fibers connecting the nucleus of lateral lemniscus as well as the two sides of nucleus, two sides of the inferior colliculus. So that is how the signals are predominantly going to the contralateral side, as well as signal is also reaching to the ipsilateral side of the cortex, that is the contralateral as well as the ipsilateral side of the cortex. If we discuss little bit about the auditory cortex, they are majorly present on the superior part of the temporal gyrus, superior temporal gyrus, and this blue structure, what you can see here, the blue colored areas are the primary auditory cortex. That means the signal which are coming from the auditory pathway primarily ends at the primary auditory cortex. This is the main receptive place of the signal from the auditory pathway. So when we discuss about any sensory cortex, there will be a primary area and there will be a secondary area. The primary area is the one which receives the signal primarily, and then they pass on the signal to the secondary association areas. Okay, so there are the association areas which are present here, depicted here, and which are present in the insular cortex as well as the parietal operculum. Okay, so these are the association areas which are responsible for interpretation of the sound. They associate the sound with different other sensations. They find out the meaning of the sound, whatever the word is spoken, what is the meaning, and the emotional aspect of the sound can also be interpreted by the areas which are located not only near to the auditory cortex but far away from the auditory cortex also. So those all parts will come under the association areas for the sound. So this is the basic picture of auditory cortex, and one thing to notice here is the frequency mapping. The frequency mapping we will discuss in another video, but still to tell about the auditory cortex, there is a frequency map. As you can see, in case of cochlea, there is a frequency which is spread out through the various region of cochlea. In the same way, that same the signal is carried in a different, in a separate, the separate frequencies are carried separately, and the same way they are supplied to the auditory cortex, where there is a map of separate frequency, and a particular the particular signal of a sound is ending on a map of that particular area of the frequency. So if you can see the auditory cortex, what is happening here is the low frequency sounds which are arising from one area of the cochlea is carried separately, and they are ending or supplied to this low frequency area of the cortex, whereas the intermediate frequency will be supplied here, and the high frequency sound which are arising from a particular area of the cortex are carried separately, and then they are supplied to the high frequency area of the cortex. So that is how this representation, tonotopic, the representation of the sound is taking place, and those signals are carried separately in the tract and supplied separately to the auditory cortex. As you can see here, in the association area also that separate tonotopic map is present. As such, it is said that in the auditory cortex there are 6 tonotopic maps, 5 to 6 tonotopic maps, which are receiving the signals from separate areas of the cochlea, and they are responsible for analyzing various aspects of the sound. So that is how the distribution of the various frequency of sound is then analyzed at the auditory cortex. So I hope this will make you understand the auditory pathway and little bit function of auditory cortex as well.